So before I continue on, what I'd like to do now is model an object to put into my scene, and then we'll set up some lights and do a render. Now, I don't really want this stage here while I'm modeling, and so what I'm going to do is use the layer system. So if I come back to the channel box, notice it's actually called the channel box / layer editor. And if I drag this little section down here up, we don't really need to drag it up, don't need much space here. Under the very first tab, display, we have tools for layering. And basically what I need to do is, for my object that is selected, it has to be selected for what I'm about to do, is this picture here. It's a picture of an object with a sphere, and the plane represents a layer. In other words, put the currently selected object onto its own layer. So create a new layer and assign these selected objects. This is my selected object, and put it onto a new layer. The V is for visible. If I click that, it disappears. The object's still there, but it's now on its own layer. Now, I'm not actually working on a specific layer. So if I make a new object, this cube, we'll notice, is separate. So the cube doesn't belong to a layer. This plane belongs to layer 1. So let's just work from this cube. I'll shrink it down a bit so it's an appropriate size compared to this little stage that we've made. Focus on it, and I'll hide that layer. So let's just do a little bit of fundamental modeling. I'm not going to go too crazy with trying to make a specific thing. There's a ton of tutorials out there on how to, beginner Maya tutorials on how to model swords and spaceships and all sorts of crazy cool stuff. This is just intended as a quick understanding of the fundamental tools. So I'm just going to make a sort of interesting shape. It's not anything specific. But the main thing I want to do here is, just like we did before, is use the extrude functionality. So I've gone into face mode, and I'm selecting a face. And let's see, I'll start from the top. So I'm going to extrude. And let's see, what I might do is grab both of these vertices, or I could just grab an edge. Hit W for my move tool and maybe drag that out a bit. Come back to face mode. It's automatically got the last face I had selected, and hit extrude. And I'm going to just leave that and hit G to extrude again. And jump back to edge, and let's just hit W and move that in a little bit. Back to face and hit G to extrude again. Let's see, I'll go back to edge mode and bring that right in. Back to face mode and hit G to extrude. I'm not really sure what I'm making here, just a shape of some sort. Let's extrude again. Edge mode. This is one but many ways to go about making things. G to extrude again. In fact, let's just repeat this a couple of times to show you another method. So what I could do now is, instead of jumping from faces to edges all the time, just extrude them as many times as I want and drag out some shapes. Another thing that I could do is grab a face and just extrude that a whole bunch, and then decide, well, actually what I want is multiple cuts through here. So chopping up your model is a fundamental skill that you'll need all the time, because you can see, in order to create this weird shape, I needed lots of these subdivisions. And so the way you can do that, one way you can do that, is with the multi-cut tool. I always think of this like a Swiss Army knife. It has a bunch of different functionality. And if I hold down the control key and nothing else, when I move my cursor around, it gives me a preview of what it'll do. So it's going to insert an edge loop. So I'm just holding down my control. I've got the multi-cut selected, holding down the control key, moving my cursor over, and now I can at any point just click and it's going to insert a loop. If I want to do one exactly in the center, I can hold down Shift and it'll snap we've got snap settings here. So I could say, actually, I want exactly 50%. So now when I hold down Shift, it's only going to snap in the exact middle. But usually leaving it at about 10 is all you need, and you can tell, just by eyeballing it, you can pretty much tell where the halfway point is. And maybe I'll do a couple more. That'll do. And now come back to Edge and make a few changes. Let's say I wanted to do something. Not sure what this is going to be, but it doesn't really matter. I might invert this. So what I want to do, it just feels a little top heavy. I want to do a rotation of exactly 180 degrees. So basically I want to rotate it around like so. Now, shortcuts to do that, if I hold the J key, while I'm holding J and clicking on an edge, a rotation axis, it'll spin around and snap, which is convenient. But if I undo, another way, of course, would be the channel box. Remember, we looked at how we can set these values. So I know that by rotating in this direction, just by changing it a little bit, I can see the rotate Z is the axis that I'm working in. So I can just, didn't even need to undo that. I can just orbit a bit and go, oh, yeah, I want it to rotate here, and I want it to go 180 degrees, and that rotates it completely around for me. So we'll notice as we model in the channel box, we're seeing all of these commands build up. The more you model, the more baggage Maya will have with the model. These are commands. It's very rare that you're going to want to come back to these. Notice though, if you do get rid of them, you won't be able to come back. But at certain points, when you decide you're happy with a model, you just hit Control S to save. And so I can save and come back to this. I could do an incremental save. So save scene as. I'm just manually incrementing this. Save as. There is a way to automatically increment and save. I typically just, I don't like the format it is using, but you can customize that in the preference settings. But what I wanted to get at was, once you're happy with your model getting to a certain point, and this isn't a lot of history, when your model gets hundreds of inputs in its history, it will lag, and that's a problem. So we can delete this what's called history by going into Edit, Delete All History. And notice that just gets rid of all of that. I can't undo now, but it's given me a nice clean model without a bunch of history. So now what I want to talk about is smoothing. If I hit 3 on the keyboard, it's a smooth preview. So this isn't actually smooth. I hit 1 to get back out of that. Properly smoothing is going into Mesh Smooth. And what it does is subdivide that model. And I can increase the number of divisions if I want. Or I can say, actually, let's just get out of this. Control Z. So ultimately, I want to smooth this. So I hit 3 to preview how generally it's going to look. And this isn't what I want. What I'm after here is to have one side of this model nice and smooth, and the other side sharp-edged. But these really, really sharp edges without bevels look terrible. And that term I just used, bevels, is what we need to do to continue. So I come into the modeling toolkit, and I want to bevel all of these edges. Let's just, I'm just going to duplicate this to show you before and after. Alright, so what I wanted to do first is select these edges at the very top and the very bottom. And I want to create just a nice soft shape. So in order to do that, I'm going to use bevel and make a very high fraction, but increase the number of segments. So segments is the number of divisions in that corner, and fraction is the percentage of that bevel. So if I hold down, notice when I click and drag on the word, it's a fairly dramatic change. If I want it to be a little slower and more subtle, if I hold down Control and click on the word, it'll go nice and slow. And I'm just trying to find a bevel that I'm happy with. I want it large but not too over the top. So I'm happy with that. Be aware this has created an n-gon, so this is quite a messy bit of geometry. Best practice if you're modeling this professionally would be to clean this up. So you would connect these vertices. I'm not going to go into detail doing this, but you would go through and connect all of these all the way through up so that it stays as quads and we don't have n-gons. But for brevity, and to try to not make this too complex of a tutorial, let's just keep it like so. It'll still work fine as a low poly model. Now when I double click, what I want to do now is select all of these outside edges. Anytime in Maya, if I double click on an edge, it'll select a continuous edge loop until it gets to essentially a fork in the road where it doesn't know how to continue. So I'm going to hold down Shift to add to my selection and double click on each edge. But I'm also going to need to select these guys in here. Now I could just go through one by one clicking the way I am, but an easier method would be to hold down Shift and Control. So I'm holding two keys on the keyboard, the Control key and the Shift key together. The reason I'm doing that, if I just hold the Shift key and I click and drag, what that does is selects whatever was not selected and it deselects whatever was selected. So I'll Control Z. If I hold down Shift and Control, now when I click and drag just over that corner, it adds to my selection without deselecting the bits I don't want. So Shift and Control, and Shift and Control up here. So again, we're looking for shortcuts to speed up our workflow, and that's just a nice easy way to get all of these edges, but I don't want these edges. Very easy to deselect those. Let's just come in here. I'm not even going to a proper orthographic view, I'll stay in the perspective view. Hold down Control, just Control, which gives me the minus symbol on the cursor, which shows me that it's going to deselect. Now moving my cursor into roughly the center, maybe I'll zoom in a little bit, move it into the center and make a big drag selection through here, and it deselects all of that in one big hit. Hit F to focus on my model so I can orbit around more smoothly, and I've got just the outside edges selected. Without having to explain that, that'd be a very quick process. So it is actually quick and easy. Now that I've got just those outside edges, nothing on the inside selected, we're going to go into bevel, and I'm going to hold down Control and click and drag on the word fraction to decide how small I want it, and I want this fairly small. I might give it just 2 segments, and before I move away from this tool by hitting Q, I'm going to just hit 3 on the keyboard and preview it, and then go, yep, happy with that, that's what I want. So hit 1 to get out of there and Q to complete that operation. So now back to object mode, and at this stage, knowing that that smooths more or less how I wanted this object, I'm going to go into mesh, smooth, and then I can maybe increase the divisions by 1. That's probably going to be enough. I could go further, but it's unnecessary. It looks fine like that. And so now by completing that operation, I'll hit Q again to get out of it, back into the select tool. And we can see now this isn't previewed, smooth previewed. This is in one mode, so it's the final version of the model. We've got quite a mess up here and down here. You would normally clean that up for a professional presentation, but you can see even as this is, for a beginner workflow, it still actually works quite well. You're not seeing that pinching caused by this mess of geometry. Just be aware that that was not great practice. It's just a quicker way to show you rather than having to go through and clean it up. But having the two next to each other, you can really see this workflow that we went through to bevel our objects made a big difference in getting a nice clean shape. And so what I might do now is come back to the layer editor, and with this selected, click on the rightmost button, create a new layer, and add to selected, and I can maybe click on this and say rename it. So double click on the layer word, and I'm going to call this something like piece 1, and double click on this and call it stage, and turn that back on, and then we'll grab that piece 1. I don't need to actually select, as long as they're both visible I can select either. There are other functions here, but we won't go into those right now. And we'll move it out here somewhere. Just one thing is, notice my cursor, my what's called the gizmo, the center pivot point, is right up here. I can reset that if I want to the exact center of the object by going into modify center pivot. So modify center pivot just snaps that pivot back down here, makes it a bit easier to move. So I might just scale this down, remembering this is a stage for rendering something, and position this. So we've got our first object. So next we'll just put in a few more simple objects, and then we'll add some materials, some lights, a camera, and render.